Okay, so my title is Nero Then and Now, Fake News, Dirty Truth, and Myth Making. And I am basically going to kind of share a little bit of the research I've done about Nero and the kind of hold he seems to have over our imagination even now, and why he's come to symbolize kind of the ultimate bad emperor. And just this week, somebody I follow on Twitter, whose handle is Metal Classicist, which pretty much tells you what you need to know about what he does, apparently spent a good part of his week compiling a table of how many metal songs mention different Roman emperors. And as we can see, Nero comes out way ahead. He's even got a healthy lead on Caligula, who is second, but everybody else is way back in the dust. And so one question that I think I'm trying to address here in this talk is why is Nero so metal? Like, why is he so attractive for people who want to kind of get at the symbolism of ancient Rome and bad emperors and sort of just this idea of like decadence and depravity and I don't know, all that stuff that makes metal so fun if you're into that kind of thing. And you know, maybe it was the neckbeard. That's one answer. I always like to give a little shout out to Nero's excellent facial hair. But I think the biggest answer, there were a lot of reasons, but I think the main thing really is this event that happened during his lifetime, and for which he gets all kinds of blame that he probably doesn't deserve. But certainly, I think it's a good lesson for all of us how your name will become attached to a catastrophic event, whether or not you had anything to do with it. And for him, this event was the Great Fire of Rome, which took it was almost a week, maybe a little more, in the middle of July in 64 CE. And so this is the thing that we just all know. If you know like one thing about ancient Rome, you know that Nero fiddled while Rome burned, right? It's just this phrase that's really made its way into our kind of cultural vocabulary. And so we see it on Reddit. I don't know. This is that sort of cat that bops his head to music meme. I don't know. You could go watch the video. It's cute. And then Urban Dictionary has an entry on this idea of the Nero complex, you know. So anybody who's basically, you know, I think all of us have done this, ignored something that is happening that really requires our immediate attention and instead kind of buried our head in the sand and done something else instead. Who hasn't, right? And then we also see it on tvtropes.org as this this sort of trope that appears in different forms of entertainment, of you know, just a wicked, bad, tyrannical leader who is just kind of really enjoying it, even when something terrible is happening that affects all these other people, but presumably not him. So we see it everywhere. And my talk today is going to go through a few different stages. The first thing we're going to do is talk about why we can't necessarily believe anything that that we get from the ancient sources about Nero, but why we try anyway. We're also going to look at some other reasons that Nero is memorable. It wasn't just the fire. I think there's a whole kind of way his persona was designed that that I think just has a lot of features that are memorable and important for us, or that we like to use to sort of make accusations against other people. So there was the cruelty, there was the swagger. We'll go through a little of that. And then we'll get to the fire. We'll talk about this whole legend of fiddling. We'll talk about what the ancient sources do say and why some of it is suspicious and why some of it we might want to believe. And but we also want to talk about why all of this kind of seems like something that people would have said about Nero, like they would have made up about him, whether or not it was true. And so it kind of leaves us in a weird place for being able to claim anything definite about this as history. But I still think, regardless of what we can say about that, there's a lot that Nero ends up meaning in culture, despite the lack of actual evidence for what he really did. And then we're going to look a little bit at some of the modern development of Nero's image, and particularly the way this idea of fiddling while Rome burned has made its way into our modern political rhetoric, and how different pretty much anybody who's ever had a position as a national leader you could just Google their name and Google like Nero, and probably some version of this cartoon would pop up. So we're just going to look at a few of them, and then we're going to do a Q&A. And one thing I want to say about the Q&A is that throughout this talk, you'll see little questions in red. And these are questions that I'm asking you. So I'm wondering what you think about this. And maybe during Q&A, certainly if you have other questions, ask those. But if you would like, maybe you could also tell me what you think about these questions I'm asking you. So to get into it, it's kind of the boring part, but here's why it's really hard to study Nero as an actual historical figure. It's because the sources we have are extremely biased, and it's mostly to do with the fact that Nero was the last of his line. He was the last Julio-Claudian emperor, right? He was he was declared an enemy of the state. He tried to escape Rome, but he ended up ending his own life as this death squad caught up with him. And then there was a really terrible, vicious civil war that you might have heard of called the Year of Four Emperors. That's because 4 different emperors came in and then got killed by the next emperor, until finally the last of those 4, Vespasian, took over, took power, kept power, and he established the following dynasty, which were known as the Flavian emperors, because that was Vespasian's family name, the gens Flavia. So you've all heard history is told by the victors, and that's definitely true here, because the Flavians, they came in, they had to establish themselves as this new dynastic family. They didn't really have a lot of claim on Rome. They weren't an old aristocratic fancy family the way the Julio-Claudians had been. And they got a lot of mileage out of basically blaming everything that had happened, even after Nero's death, on Nero, because the Flavians themselves had been very involved in this terrible civil war and killed lots of people. And one way of sort of diverting everyone's attention from all of that was to kind of point out how much worse Nero had been and try to sort of claim that anything that was still going wrong in Rome, including later fires, actually, were somehow kind of Nero's fault. So they did this, and Nero was also subjected to a formal process that we now call damnatio memoriae, but this is this process of memory sanctions where they would chisel your name out of inscriptions. Sometimes they would recarve statues so they didn't look like you anymore. And actually this coin that you see here on the screen is a really good example, because I think this is the most important thing about damnatio memoriae. It's not that you erase somebody, it's that you keep their image around, but you do something to it to tell the public that they're bad and that they need to be remembered as a negative figure. So in this case, they took a coin that Nero had issued and they stamped this slash across his neck, which says SPQR, which you probably all know means Senate and People of Rome. And so it's sort of this symbolic, the Senate and People of Rome have executed Nero. They have declared him an enemy. And so that keeps circulating with that message. And so somewhat in the same line, all of our surviving sources on Nero are writing at least 40 years after his death. And they're actually writing even after the collapse of the Flavian dynasty. So the Flavians went way out of their way to make Nero sound like the worst person ever. And everything that was written about Nero during the Flavian dynasty was super negative. And those are the sources that our surviving authors are using to create their accounts of Nero. So we have Tacitus, he's the earliest, but he's still writing, like Nero dies in 68, he's writing 110-ish, 120-ish, we don't totally know. And so that's still like a really long time after Nero, right? And then Suetonius is even a little later than Tacitus, and then Cassius Dio is writing 100 years after Tacitus and Suetonius. So these are the 3 sources we use, and they're all really far removed from Nero. They're not firsthand sources. And it's, okay, that said, I'm not saying Nero was a good guy. I'm just saying I think he was maybe not that much worse than a lot of other emperors that just, they got the chance to clean up their image and improve their legacy, and Nero didn't, because he died. And then this whole other dynasty went to town on him. So all of his bad behavior is recorded and everyone makes a really big deal out of it. And that just isn't true of all of these other emperors, some of whom were also pretty terrible. So, it's kind of a little biographical portrait of him, is just how he came to power. Probably most of you know his mother, Agrippina, is accused of having poisoned his stepdad, Claudius, who was the emperor, so that Nero could inherit. So that's how he gets on the throne. And then Claudius's son, Britannicus, is sort of competition for the throne, so he has him killed. I should say he doesn't personally kill any of these people. He orders other people to poison them or execute them, or some of them he orders them to kill themselves, which was really common back then, actually. So anyway, after about 5 years in power, he gets tired of his mom. He thinks she's too controlling, whatever. So even though she's the one that put him on the throne, he has her bumped off. He never really liked his first wife, Octavia. He was forced to marry her, even though they were like both teenagers, and she was also his stepsister and also his cousin. So he was never really into her. I know, it's gross, right? But he couldn't divorce her without upsetting a lot of people, and he wanted to marry somebody else. So he has her killed. And then one of his major advisors, who'd been sort of a stabilizing influence, he's accused of killing him. And then, I mean, one reason he does a lot of these earlier murders is because he thinks these people are a threat to him. He thinks that somehow they might push him out of power or whatever. And so he's paranoid, but by the time he gets around to 65 CE, he's right to be paranoid. They are trying to kill him. This guy, Piso, puts together a really big conspiracy, and Piso is planning, of course, on replacing him with himself, Piso. So he finds out about it. He kills everybody who was even remotely involved, and also their moms. And in the sort of wrap up of this giant conspiracy purge, 3 really famous authors end up dying. There's a poet, Lucan, Seneca, the philosopher, Petronius, probably, who's the author of the Satyricon, which sometimes you read maybe some of you have read Trimalchio's Dinner. That's a little excerpt from the Satyricon. Anyway, he kills all them. His best general, Corbulo, he kills almost entirely because Corbulo's been really successful and he's getting popular, and Nero's afraid that he'll come back to Rome and take over. And then he also kills his second wife, Poppaea, while she was pregnant. They got in an argument, and he seems to have felt bad about that one later. But yeah, so he's not a great guy. But I think that, like I said, we remember him extra badly because these were all of these stories and all of these killings were described in a lot of detail, mostly by Tacitus. And we just don't have the parts of Tacitus where he tells us about, say, all of Caligula's terrible behavior, or the accounts of like all the people that Augustus had murdered when he was rising to power. Mostly didn't survive, sometimes because Augustus himself had them burned. So like I said, some emperors were better at cleaning up their legacy than others. And then, another fact that I think people should consider is that if you're just talking about like how many people died on somebody's orders, Nero wasn't very aggressive militarily. He didn't send out his armies to conquer large populations or territories. And so he's probably like sort of just person for person responsible for killing and enslaving way fewer people than emperors like Vespasian and Trajan, who were big on conquest. So I think a question for you that maybe we can talk about later is, why do you think that these emperors are remembered so much more positively than Nero? I mean, or what does it say maybe about Roman history and the way it was recorded that is true, that some people's killings and murders get excused and others don't? So, just something to think about. It's also true that Nero very much saw himself as an artistic genius. And this is one thing that makes him different than almost all the other emperors. He was really devoted to literature and music. He performed poetry that he'd written himself. He had this really complicated instrument, the Kitthara, that he accompanied himself on. He loved theater. He performed actually on the stage, both in tragedy and in dance performances. He loved chariot racing. He competed as a charioteer. He trained, like really diligently, actually. But all of this was actually seen as absolutely terrible, at least by sources like Tacitus, because most athletes and most performers in the ancient world were enslaved. So anyone who does those activities is by association degrading themselves and putting themselves in the position of someone currently or formerly enslaved. And so, of course, elite Romans were completely horrified by this. But he's really an expert at, there are people who do like this. The elite is shocked, but it does seem that the public really loved it. And so another question might be, was Nero trying to connect with the public at large. You know, he was offending this very small segment of society at the top, but was he doing it because he saw that the most important support he could have was from the people? And are there pros and cons to being a leader or a communicator who can really work with a popular group? So yeah, ooh, Luciano, you want to respond or?
Yes, I do want to respond.
Okay.
A pro of the strategy is that you're directing the large portion of the public's focus away from great tragedies. Like, let's say,
Mhm.
for example, Nero killed a bunch of people, and those families are super sad, and they might have rebelled if not Nero hadn't put on a really cool liar performance or something.
Yeah, I think that's a really workable theory. And yeah, famously the poet Juvenal, who also wrote like 40, 50 years after Nero, he has that phrase bread and circuses, right? You know, like if you give the people that, then you can get away with a lot. So was he doing this? So he definitely had, and I think it's also true that he was going to have an image of himself that was maybe not the way the whole rest of the world would see it. It's clear that, I mean, the sources do not think he was actually any good at any of the stuff he was into. Like he was very into singing, very into chariot racing. No one else seems to think he was doing a great job at that. Um, there is a story that somebody faked his own death to get out of attending one of Nero's concerts, which were mandatory. He sponsored not one but two Neronian games, which were this massive festival where all these people would come and perform and compete in all these different events, and he himself would perform and compete, which again they really thought was shocking. When he toured Greece, he actually, the Greece had all these famous games, like the Olympic Games, of course, but a bunch of others too. There were games in like Nemean and Corinthian. He made them all do it in that year so he could compete in them. So he'd be like, great, great, you're not supposed to have it for another 3 years. I mean, but what about this summer? And so then he'd go in, and then like all these actual athletes had to let him win all these events because he was the emperor. So, I mean, he was definitely also seen as sexually dissolute and depraved. He was always falling in love with women who were inappropriate because they were married or they were freed women. He had a couple of same-sex marriage ceremonies, and the sources present these as fake ceremonies or sham ceremonies, but at least one of them, the second one, he and that person stayed together for a long time, and he referred to that person as his wife. And so, I don't know. There were rumors that he had an incestuous affair with his mother, but this is the kind of thing that they say about all the bad emperors. So I don't know. That's another one that I'm not sure we want to give too much credit to. Tacitus has a very salacious account of a couple of these wild all-night parties he would have where there were a lot of things going on. But yeah, so he was maybe doing some of that stuff. But however it was perceived by the public, you've got to remember he was also kind of surrounded by a bunch of people who were telling him everything he did was great. And so I'm not sure that he would have had a very accurate idea of how much he was succeeding or not in some of these ventures because of his position, which, he was born into. It wasn't necessarily his fault. And then, he had his famous last words, qualis artifex perio. So these were recorded by Suetonius, who usually tells us, he likes to tell you what the emperor's last words for. He did one for all the 12 Caesars. So funny thing, most of you are Latin students, and so Latin didn't have any punctuation when it was written down in the original. And also some of these words can mean different things. And so some of the things that this could mean are what an artist dies in me, because so that is qualis is sort of a kind of intensifying what he's saying about himself, which is that he's an artist. But qualis could be a question. So he could have been asking, what sort of artist do I die as? Artifacts could have been working almost like an adverb. So it could be like, I'm dying so artistically. But artifacts can also mean not just artists the way we understand it, but like craftsmen, like manual sort of like a fix-it person or a furniture maker. So he could have been saying that he's dying in this degraded state as sort of a handyman. So, you know what? Let's save some of these questions for the end, just so we. But do come back to it. Make a note, and we'll. And this could be a conversation for us when we get it. So the 64 fire, Nero's defining moment, is. I don't want to get into the whole did he actually set fire to the city or not story. I don't think that there's any way for us to really know. But it is true that if the fire was going to catch fire, if the city was going to catch on fire by accident, mid-July is a great time for that to happen because it was super hot. Access to water was, spotty at best, and there weren't any sort of building regulations in ancient Rome. So a lot of things, we think of it as like all of this marble and stone, but there were a lot of really janky things that were basically just wicker with plaster on it, just incredibly flammable stuff. So it was the kind of thing that definitely was going to happen at some point. And so did it have some help, and was that help Nero? We can never say, but it starts near the circus at the edge of the imperial palace, actually. There's very strong wind, which I don't think they could have counted on. But because of that strong wind, it really just whips through the city. It seems like it's dying out after a few days, but it actually catches again on the property of one of Nero's top officials. I admit that looks suspicious, but again, could have been an accident. Nero was definitely not personally involved in starting the fire because he was out of town when it started. He did come back immediately well, not immediately, but I mean, fires did break out in Rome a lot. So you wouldn't necessarily hurry back just because you heard that there was a bad fire, but once it had gone on for like 2 or 3 days, he booked it back. And by the time it was put out, according to Tacitus, basically at least half the city was just devastated, more than half. And in fact, only 4 of the 14 districts were not affected at all. And so the other 10 were just gone, or very little was remaining. But even Tacitus, who really does not like Nero, has to admit that Nero's cleanup was really good. He had some good food relief efforts, and that he put into place, he put some important regulations for building in the future and for water supply in the future that made Rome safer in the long run. So he does say that, but most of all, we do have this story about this incredibly dramatic reaction that he is supposed to have had, where he fiddled. So of course you all know it wasn't a fiddle because there were no fiddles then. But what did we really say? What do the sources really say? I mean, probably everything I'm about to tell you isn't true, but we still need to look at what they claimed. So what Tacitus says, who's the earliest of our 3 sources, is he says the rumor had spread that at that very time the city was in flames. Nero made his entrance onto a private stage, and he sang. It's not clear whether he sang about the Trojan destruction, or whether that's the title of whatever he was singing. So it's either he sang it or he sang of it. And it says that he was likening present catastrophes to ancient ones. So the thing I want us to focus on now is that Tacitus does go out of his way to point out that this is only a rumor. He doesn't say that this definitely happened. And the later sources who come after him, Suetonius and Cassius Dio, both don't say that. They both say this definitely happened. But Tacitus is the earliest source. And I think if he had been able to claim in good conscience that Nero definitely did this, he would have. So he's admitting that we can't prove this and that it is just a rumor. And that gets forgotten a lot when this episode is recounted. Some other discussion in the sources that I think maybe points us toward this is a rumor, this is folklore, is that Suetonius and Dio, those 2 later sources, they disagree on a lot of details about exactly how this went down. Like everyone says he went up to some kind of viewing point and he did some kind of a song, but Suetonius says that it's this property on the Esquiline Hill, which was owned by Nero but wasn't the palace. Dio does say it's on the Palatine Hill. So they're kind of not getting their details right. They're kind of like those, like they're like bad witnesses in a murder case. They're kind of like maybe there's some source that says it, but nothing's agreeing at this point. So one way of understanding this is maybe they're making up some details, or maybe they're choosing to trust one source when there are several that don't agree because they want it to sound more convincing. They also don't agree on what he was singing or even what he was wearing when he was singing it. So Suetonius says that it was a scene from Tragedy and that he wore a stage costume. So that would imply one kind of performance. And then Dio says that no, it was a Kitthara. He got out his big fancy lyre and wore this really long, complicated, sort of floppy frock that the Kitthara, the player of the Kitthara, always played. So this is on the right there is a statue of Apollo, who was also a Kitthara performer and was one of Nero's favorite gods. So you know, another thing they don't tell us for sure is what language this was even in, because Nero did know and perform in both Latin and Greek. So there are all kinds of questions that aren't answered here. I mean, of those two stories, if either of them were true, I think the Kitthara makes more sense, just because he was very into this instrument. And it was not a lyre, not a fiddle. It's a very complicated, very expensive performance instrument. It's bigger, it's louder, and it's much more difficult to play than like an everyday lyre. You can see it's got all these knobs that you have to turn, and it's just bulkier. And so I think maybe it's a little like one of those, like one of those double neck guitars that, you know, some of our metal performers play. It's kind of like showing off to play the Kitthara. And the most famous composition that he ever performed was with the Kitthara, and it was a song about the fall of Troy. So he actually does this after the Great Fire. This seems like a very weird and inappropriate thing to do, but about a year after the fire, he had another of these Nero festivals, and he performed this song that was about the event that he's supposed to have performed during the fall of Troy. So again, I think this can tell us, you know, either he's just a terrible guy and he's repeating this famous performance that everyone thinks he did, or this performance is what people like, this is what gave people the idea for the rumor, you know. That's another way of seeing it. It's also true that being obsessed with Troy was sort of running in his family, because Nero was descended from the first emperor, Augustus. And Augustus, of course, through Julius Caesar, traced their family's lineage literally back to Aeneas, who had escaped from the flames of Troy. So in a way, maybe Nero was even reenacting a famous scene from the Aeneid that some of you may have read in book 2. That's all told from you know, in Aeneas's voice, and he's telling Dido about the night that Troy was destroyed. And he when he first realizes what's happening, he wakes up from this dream, right? And he runs up to his rooftop and he sees the whole city on fire, and he compares it. He makes a very elaborate simile comparing it to like a shepherd watching a, you know, a storm coming rushing through and flooding his flocks and so on. So in a weird way, was Nero kind of replaying Aeneas? Was he seeing his city being destroyed, and was he like having this creative moment in the middle of it? Just a question. We can never for sure know the answer, but I think it's interesting to think about. It's also true that, I mean, if we were going to say it was a tragic performance, there was evidence for that too, because he did perform on stage. He played the role of Oedipus, who was famous for, of course, sleeping with his mother, which was something Nero was accused of doing. He also played the role of Hercules, who famously actually sort of got possessed with madness and killed his wife and his children, which is also something Nero was accused of doing. So in a way, is this sort of burning Rome, singing about burning Troy bit a little bit like how he was performing these mythic roles that he seemed to embody? And was this just another part of his sort of very transgressive persona of like blurring myth and reality? So some other reasons that he's remembered very negatively for this event have to do with what happened in history way after Nero's death, because Tacitus does report that he did blame some very early Christians for maybe starting this fire, and that he executed them in this really bizarre, spectacular way where he tied them up as like human torches and burned them and set them on fire while everybody kind of had a party. So yeah, that's bad. But actually Tacitus doesn't really care that much about the Christians. They weren't considered a big deal at that time. But a couple hundred years later, when Christianity really took off, this event is sort of remembered as this terrible martyrdom. And so that really blows Nero's name up into a whole other register of badness that I don't think Nero could have predicted. And then the other thing he did that the Flavians, who came after him, made a really big deal out of, is that he took a lot of the burned part of the city and he used it to create this giant palace that's like, it wasn't just a palace, it's like an estate with like a bunch of different buildings and water features and fancy things. And It's really cool. You can actually go visit parts of it in Rome today. So if you ever do get the chance to go to Rome and do that, I highly recommend it. But this was seen as a horrible land grab. It's right in the middle of the city, and all of it now belongs to Nero. Became a symbol of his selfishness. But I again think we have to remember that he was someone who really invited the public in a lot, and maybe this was a way of connecting with his public and showing them this beautiful space, and like an extension of his personality. Like, was this sort of like HGTV, like people like looking at fun renovations. So did he think that that's what he was doing, whether or not it worked out? But again, the Flavians did a really good job of making him sound terrible for this. They took the place that had been his private lake, and they built the Colosseum over it, so that everyone would sort of remember how Nero had done something selfish with this space, and they had done something, for the people. So if you ever do again get to Rome and admire the Colosseum, remember that Nero's lake was right underneath it. So some quick conclusions about this fire and fiddling story before we look at a couple of these cartoons. I know we need to wrap up soon. I think that what we can argue is that because Nero was the last of his dynasty, his legacy was reimagined in this incredibly negative way by the next regime. But what he seems to be doing is something that I think a lot of people in Rome did, and that I think we still do, which is that he was likening present misfortunes to past ones, and he was aligning Rome with a grand classical past in order to kind of emphasize the importance of what was happening. And I think we do still do this. Um, and so I think that, but by the same token, he might have done that, sure. But also, you can see how everybody else in Roman society might have done the same thing and made up that story about him, because it sort of fit in with those values. And so I would argue that what we're still doing with this story and with this accusation about Nero and fiddling is kind of another version of that. It's still likening ancient, present misfortunes to ancient ones. It's still trying to reach out to something kind of grand and mythical to make a present moment seem more important or more meaningful. And it's been done really for as long as there's been political cartoons. So we have one here from the 1700s, the American Revolution. We have one from the Civil War. We've got one from Hitler and the Holocaust. And we can talk about these more in detail later. We've got one for George W. Bush. Obama got the selfie treatment with it. And then, of course, I think maybe we all remember this really weird tweet from March 2020, and then how that kind of, even more than before, invited comparisons between, I think, Trump and Nero, which Bernie Sanders didn't miss. We heard this at the Democratic National Convention broadcast, that Nero had fiddled while Rome burned, Trump golfs, et cetera, et cetera. And let me tell you, this whole golfing, fiddling thing it's kind of its own lecture that we don't have time to get into. But yeah, people went wild with that after Bernie's speech. So we got this tweet, we got this cartoon. But actually, this had its own little history. And I think it's like a weird object lesson in how you want to be careful about who you make accusations like this against, because they can come back to bite you. So this was already happening to Obama in, in the last two presidencies ago. And then actually, Donald Trump saw fit to tweet a lot about how mad it made him whenever Barack Obama golfed. But then when Trump got into office, people were already very primed to basically keep track of all his golfing, and he quickly exceeded the golf trips of like all previous presidents. And even within the first 100 days of his administration, there were cartoons making jokes about this and kind of calling us back to this argument that kind of he'd started. So our conclusions are here that I think are important, and I know we have to wrap up, is that certain aspects of the Nero fiddling message, I think, have changed over time. So in the ancient legend, I think we see a real emphasis on the song about Troy and Nero's special connection to Troy because of his heritage and his obsession with the arts and performance. And like all of that kind of is lost, and fiddling just sort of symbolizes any sort of like dumb distraction activity that you shouldn't be doing. And then Tacitus, I think, very strongly creates a sense that Nero should never have been in charge to begin with. And so, of course, he messed up when this terrible thing happened, because he didn't deserve to be emperor to begin with. And I don't think that gets into the cartoon discourse very much. And anyway, instead, I think that what they all trade on is like, really, it's the memishness of it. It's just how instantly recognizable it is. Once you put Rome and a fire and a fiddle into the picture, everyone knows what that symbolizes. And so all you need is like something bad happening, and then you need someone to be doing some sort of dumb hobby that they shouldn't be doing, or going to Cancun, you know, or whatever it is they do. And you're going to get this cartoon. So, but I do think that that last example with the golf is a reminder that using this charge against a rival is no guarantee that it won't then be used against you, you know, when you are when the shoe's on the other foot. And I think there's also like a universal anxiety here. It isn't just like a dumb, lazy accusation that people make. I think it represents something really deep about how afraid we are of having people in charge who don't suffer any consequences when bad things happen. And we also are really afraid of putting so much power in one person's hands that when something terrible happens, when we have this moment of catastrophe, they're the only ones who could possibly help. And the rest of us are just helpless or powerless. And then I wonder if that's really true, though. I mean, do we really think that that's the only message it can send? There is this one cartoon that I'm going to end with by another really famous cartoonist, Tom Tolles. And so we see here, this Nero figure is looking at his phone while something burns. And he actually made a comment about this on his blog. He said, like, we all enjoy getting all outraged when we see somebody, or we think of someone seeing these fires and yet just entertaining himself instead. But how bad does the evidence of, say, climate catastrophe need to be before we start fiddling on our smart devices and start acting like we are smart ourselves? So in a way, like, are we all Nero? Do we all need to think about this? And one more question for you, and I really will end now, is actually though, is the smartphone the fire? Is our obsession with things that are happening online, you know, that we're entertaining ourselves with, that we're obsessing over, and we're getting into weird internet wormholes and conspiracy theories and whatever, is that the fire itself? So is the fiddle also the fire? And that is it. I've got some little things here that I've also published on this topic that you might want to look at later, but I would like to stop and do some questions.
I never knew that I actually went to Rome before, and I actually didn't know that used to be a huge lake.
Yeah, right. I know. I didn't either, actually. So yeah, well, you know it now. So you ever go back and yeah, it's actually, that's why it's not very stable ground. And that's actually why parts of it have fallen down over the years, is because it used to just be sort of like muddy. But yeah, isn't it interesting that the Flavians would go so far out of their way to put something there, though, to remind people that? Yeah, definitely. Okay, I see a hand up. I think I see a Luciano hand up, and
Jade, you also raised your hand.
oh, okay. All right. Well, let's do Jade and then Luciano then. Yeah.
So can we, after we ask our questions, can we leave or?
I don't know, Anna. They probably can.
To go, you can go.
Yeah.
All right, so I think Jade can ask her question now.
Mhm.
So what's your personal opinion? Do you think that Nero should have gotten all his blame? Do you think that serves him right? Or do you think that if Nero has to get that amount of blame for what he did, the other emperors should get it too? Like, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, gosh, I don't know. I don't want to seem like I'm like justice for Nero, you know, because I think he was a bad dude, but I think he does get a bad rap in comparison with some other emperors who were absolutely as bad that don't get remembered that way. So yeah, I guess I think if Nero is going to get this this kind of accusation against him, then we ought to just pay a little more attention to all of the other people who just don't get put on blast the same way, but were guilty of, you know, maybe, and I actually don't, if you like really insisted, I don't think that he did do either of these things, because it just seems so likely that people would make it up, to be honest. But yeah, that's what I think. Other hands up? Anyone? Oh, okay. Look, is Nelwyn? Yeah. Is that? Sorry, I don't know if I'm saying your name right. Nelwyn, is that?
Yeah, hi.
Yeah.
So I really enjoyed the political cartoon, since I was wondering if you're able to share your presentation, because I want to look at them again.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. I could put it in the chat, I think.
Yes.
Yes,
The slides and a recording of the presentation will be available on Sched afterwards, so you will have the opportunity to look at it.
Oh, definitely,
Okay.
yeah. But I have some little things in the speaker notes where I have like the URLs where I found them and stuff. So maybe that would be handy. All right, I'll just do that. Not a big deal.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Let's see, share. And okay, well, I'll do that in a second. I'm just I don't know. Anna, is there anybody else with their hand up?
I think Luciano had a question.
Right, yeah, definitely.
This is less of a question and more of a comment. So for the Q&A things, am I allowed to, okay. So for the Nero's last word things, I would either interpret it as option number 2 or number 4, because of the number 4, because he's like kind of like a entitled rich kid. He's like, oh, I'm dying such like a poor person. I'm dying like a handyman.
Yeah, it's bad, isn't it? Yeah, that's the least sympathetic of the choices for sure.
Yeah, but also option number 2 probably. I think that was the I'm dying so artistically one maybe.
Yeah.
Very poetic, and also it's like it's as well as very poetic to like like in stories it's very poetic when it's like, oh, I'm so sad the military is coming for me.
Yeah, no, Nero lived for the drama, so yeah, I think they all make sense to me. I kind of like that we can never be sure. That's the kind of thing that Latin does that makes me happy. Yeah. Great. And all right, any if there aren't any more questions, I know I did kind of run over a little on my time, but don't I could I don't know. I could show you some of the slides I skipped, but but yeah, no, it's great. All right, got some questions. Yeah, all right, we got more votes for 2 and 4. I like it. Oh, Jade's got a question, or are you going? Okay, all right, I guess we're heading out. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming to this. This was really fun. Go Menlo, go JCL. I appreciate all of you.